morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden. I'm with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, November 1st, 2021. And if you're like me, you've probably had some statist pig respond to any complaint about the size of government, about government power, some government program with something like, if you don't like it here, move to Cuba, or at least you're free to spout your mouth off. You've got freedom of speech, right? And I think the implication is really that we live in the so-called land of the free, and so we're still able to exercise rights to some degree, if not perfectly, and then, of course, better than elsewhere. And I really have two major problems with that. One, I know it's popular to grade things on a curve. Everyone wants to grade things as if it's less bad than somewhere else. But either you have freedom or you don't. Either you have liberty or you don't. Liberty doesn't come with a government permission slip. And less bad is still better than more bad, but less bad isn't necessarily liberty. But more importantly than that, than just the grading on a curve idea, just because you're able to exercise a right today, even uninhibited, that doesn't mean you're actually free according to the views of the founders and the old revolutionaries. You just might be, I guess, lucky, we'll put it that way. And for some perspective on this, today I've got some insight from people like John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, St. George Tucker, Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. And from their views, I've put together my own take on this to wrap it up. 4 essential principles, 4 main pillars that are needed for a free society. But first, I do want to take a quick moment and say thank you, a huge thank you, to just a handful of the people who have recently joined us as members recently. There is Constance in California, Lynn in Texas, Matthew in Nebraska, Zane in Georgia, Rosalie in California, and Lisa in New Mexico. There's absolutely nothing, and I mean that, nothing that helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. Our membership program starts as just as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And let's get right to it. I want to go right to John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written in response to the hated Townsend Acts of 1767. He wrote them all near the end of 1767 and published them on an ongoing basis, 12 letters. And here from letter 7, he actually asks the essential question that we're asking here on this episode today. For who are a free people? Not those, Dickinson wrote, over whom government is reasonable and equitably exercised. So just because government is doing the right thing, government is not violating your rights, that does not mean you're necessarily a free people. But those, he wrote, who live under a government so constitutionally checked and controlled that proper provision is made against it being otherwise exercised. So he's saying just because they're doing the right thing in government, that doesn't mean you're free. It's my take on it that is, well, it's just luck. You happen to have people who are doing the right thing in office. And you may know, if you follow the show closely, that Dickinson sent these letters before they were all published. He started publishing some of them, I believe. He sent them to Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr., of course, the vaunted Sons of Liberty in Boston, and said, you guys, this is the cradle. You guys got to do something with these. Move forward against these Townsend Acts. So Adams primarily, but also James Otis Jr., they responded by writing the Massachusetts Circular Letter, which was passed in February of 1768, and they took some of these positions as well. For example, they wrote, in all free states, the Constitution is fixed. This is the argument against a living, breathing Constitution. If you're going to have rules for government, and government can determine how those rules are going to be used, how much power they're going to have, then, well, you're not going to have freedom for very long. In all free states, they wrote, the Constitution is fixed, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. So that's a very important point there. And Dickinson then Oh, well, yeah, Dickinson explained why. Here in letter 9 from the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, again, published in 1767 and 1768. This is an example I've given many times. The problem for Dickinson and the problem for so many of the other founders, Thomas Jefferson in his arguments against Hamilton's National Bank in 1791, he specifically pointed out to take a single step beyond the bounds of the Constitution is to take hold of a boundless field of power. Because as soon as you allow them to take one small step beyond their limits, then they might as well have whatever power they want, because eventually that's what's going to happen. And Dickinson most famously wrote about this, at least to the founding generation, wrote about this in 1767, 1768, in letter number 9. He called it one of the most memorable examples in history, at least to that generation. Certainly not to us, because we don't learn about problems with government power in government-run schools. We learn that government is the solution to every single problem, whether they're caused by government or something else. This is one of the most memorable examples in history to Dickinson and the old revolutionaries. He said Spain was once free. Their Cortes, that's their parliament, resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. So people could not have money raised on them without approving it, whether it was through, some kind of representation, basically, not pure consent, but this is how they viewed it. He goes further. He said, one of their kings having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, and of course we know that war leads to all kinds of executive power, expansion of power in government. It always has, it always will. James Madison referred to it as the greatest threat to public liberty because it leads to armies and debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments, according to the father of the Constitution, for putting the many under the domination of the few. Side note. So, of course, we know that the king of Spain was in a war against the Moors. The rhymes are intended today, I guess. He desired that if the sum which they had given, the money that he had raised for that war, should not be sufficient, he might be allowed, quote, for that emergency only, and Dickinson himself put it in italics, for that emergency only, to raise more money without assembling the Cortes. So there was a rule. Whether you like the rules, you think they're sufficient or not, the fact is the government had a rule. The rule was you can't raise money without having the parliament there to approve it, debate about it, and approve it. And he said, well, now we've got an emergency situation, and it's hard to get you guys back together for this emergency. We hear this all the time today. I've read through the Constitution. I read the Articles of Confederation. I read through all this stuff. I've never seen an emergency clause in the Constitution that says, well, this First Amendment, the Second Amendment, this restriction on regulation, this doesn't actually come to play anymore except when there's an emergency. And the government then gets to decide what that emergency is. So he actually begged for this money, this power to raise money, and maybe he was just going to be a good person and just do it for that emergency. Of course, we heard that the progressive income tax, this was going to be a temporary wartime measure. The Patriot Act was just going to be used for the terrorists. We've heard this all through history. We hear this in our own lifetime as well. But it was opposed aggressively in that parliament, but eventually it won out. They gave him that emergency power, and Dickinson put it this way: this single concession, as Jefferson put it some decades later, a single step beyond the limits of power, takes over a boundless field of power. And that's the same thing Dickinson said. This single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity, not in emergency, but just if they need to. From that period, Dickinson wrote, the Cortes ceased to be useful and the people ceased to be free. And I think the Congress of the United States, of the Imperial Congress of the Empire, has ceased to be useful for the Constitution and liberty for well over a century. We could actually go all the way back to 1791 to say when things went off the rails, that single concession, even 1789. And that's why Jefferson said, and I cannot do this in Latin. My Latin is terrible, but he said, oppose a disease at its beginning. And so precedent is the major problem. I covered St. George Tucker's great book, View of the Constitution of the United States, written or published in 1803 last week. And here's how he put it. He had the same message decades later. He said, it is the due restraint and not the moderation of rulers that constitutes a state of liberty. So if government is restricted, then you have a state of liberty. If it's not, even if it's not violating your rights, you're not in a state of liberty. For Tucker, he says, the power to oppress, though never exercised, does constitute a state of slavery. In essence, a kind master is still a master. A master is a master whether they're violating your personal autonomy, whether they're attacking you, whether they're being good to you, allowing you to do things, giving you permission slips to defend your home and your family. They are still a master. But of course, we can't just rely on words on paper to enforce themselves. The Constitution was never expected to enforce itself, and relying on it is just dumb. It has been extremely dangerous to the Constitution and liberty. I should mention, if you're enjoying the show so far, I'm going to get into a little bit more of this, especially on the enforcement in just a moment. Please consider smashing the like button, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or any of the mainstream platforms that we stream on. Or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, any other podcast platform. All these kind of things trigger the algorithm, especially the mainstream platforms, and it tells them to show the program to more people, and it helps out a ton. Of course, our show homepage, where you can find all the different platforms, are on live streaming, video, archive-only video, audio-only podcast edition, plus all of the archives, individual episodes. I include a bunch of links and show notes, and you can find our membership program as well. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Thank you for allowing me that quick promotional note here, that time for a promotional message. But let's get right back to it. I want to go to Dickinson as well. Of course, we were talking about the idea that constitutions don't enforce themselves. First of all, you need to have strict limitations on government power. But if you rely on government to determine the extent of its own power, you shouldn't be surprised when that power continues to grow, no matter who's in office. And that's how Dickinson put it when he was arguing for ratification of the Constitution in 1788. He said, a good constitution promotes, but not always produces, a good administration. So you want to have the best constitution possible. He was the primary author of the Articles of Confederation. He was on board. I mean, we could call him, and I started calling him this at a speech I gave in Virginia last month. He's, in essence, we call Madison the father of the Constitution. That's really not necessarily correct, but that's how people know him. He's kind of well known behind it. But we could probably call John Dickinson the father of the Articles of Confederation, although there were many other people involved. But he recognized that no matter what you put on paper, you still end up with humanity. And people, whether in government or people who are supposed to keep it in check outside of government, that is the people of the several states, they can be corrupt, and they can demand exercises of power beyond the limits of the Constitution. In fact, most of the time today, we have people begging for it. So he wrote this in his Fabius letters in 1788, that you can't necessarily count on words on paper to get the job done. And here's Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention talking about trusting politicians to follow the rules of the proposed Constitution. He thought it was absolutely nuts, and he was actually a little bit better at it than me. He said, would not all the... So he's talking about this argument that, well, the structure of the document, and some of the big government people definitely tried to sell them on the idea, or succeeded in selling people on the idea, that the checks and balances inherent in the system would draw only the good people to power, to office. And Benjamin Franklin pointed out, even though he didn't agree with all of the Constitution on the last day of the Philadelphia Convention, he pointed out, like, at first we're going to have good people administering this. We're going to have good people, but it's not going to last real long. It's not going to last forever. And eventually the people will become corrupt and demand despotism. So he knew that this type of thing would happen. And that's what Patrick Henry was talking about in the Virginia Ratifying Convention as well. If you trust just people to do the right thing, eventually you have horrible people and they do the wrong thing, and they're always going to expand power, aggrandize themselves. So he's responding to this notion that, okay, yeah, maybe we'll have some good people, but, he said, would not all the world from the eastern to the western hemisphere blame our distracted folly in resting our rights upon the contingency of our rulers being good or bad? I mean, that is pretty nuts. Like, you just got to get the right people in office. I mean, that's how most people treat things today. You just got to get the right people there, right people on the court, right people in Congress, right people in the White House, right people in the governor's office. And no one's paying attention to the fact that we live under the largest government in the history of the globe. It doesn't matter whether the right people are there or not. There are no right people because there's too much power, and whoever is there is going to be corrupted, have the corrupting influence influence of power. It attacks and gets at everyone who is a human. So unless there's lizard people there that can, well, that's another conversation. Anyways, Patrick Henry goes on. He says, why would we put our rights in the contingency? We don't want rights in a contingency. He said, show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. I say that the loss of that dearest privilege has ever followed, with absolute certainty, every such mad attempt. And I may have called it nuts in describing how Patrick Henry, but he called it a mad attempt to just trust politicians to do the right thing. Because, of course, power always seeks to expand. And that's how Dickinson himself put it back to the letters of farmer in Pennsylvania, letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. I will link to these, of course, these source documents in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Here he is in letter number 6. I'm pretty sure it's 6. You'll find out. You could tell me if I screwed that one up. But anyways, he put it this way. All artful rulers, and in fact, that's probably redundant, artful and rulers, because if someone's in power, and especially today, and maybe at the time it was a little different, but today, if someone is in a place of power, they're a pretty sneaky person. They're artful. They're creative in how to get there. They're power mongers. But all artful rulers, he wrote, who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits. He's not necessarily making any specific case about these are the only limits that are good ones. And in fact, they could just have very few limits. But even if you only have one limit rather than 100 or 1,000 or boxing them in on paper, when you have limits on paper, you will always find rulers who want to expand them beyond that. They're going to do it. This is just how it goes. This is human nature. It's all through history. They endeavor, Dickinson wrote, to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. When was the last time you heard some politician say, we got to have this mandate or this program or this regulation or this act? And, well, it's not constitutional, but we really, really need it because it's an emergency. No. They just say, well, we need it. They start with what they want to do, and then they find a way to shoehorn their view into the Constitution or into some court case or whatever it may be. And of course, Brutus, the great anti-federalist, did warn us about having ambiguous terms, and I covered this regarding his 11th paper just a week or so ago. His 11th paper where he first started talking about the judiciary, maybe it was the 12th, but he was basically saying when you have a situation where government politicians, government lawyers, government judges are making determinations about power, and even the legal minds during the ratification period couldn't actually always agree on what some phrases like general welfare and commerce and things like that meant. He's like, that's going to give a lot of latitude for those judges to expand that power. And you shouldn't be surprised when they certainly do that. And of course, we live in that situation today. So we know that rulers will always try to claim that everything that they do is legal. They don't want to go out there and say, I'm violating all your rules and then get overthrown or something like that. He said, those who succeed them may venture to go a little further. For each new encroachment will be strengthened by a former. This is another case against precedent. As soon as you establish a precedent, they will always try to build on that. Government people always look at the current amount of power as a floor, not a ceiling. Like, oh, okay, well, here's where we are now. What else can I do? They're all just awful pigs. Anyways, a free people, therefore, now, I shouldn't say all. That's actually wrong. There are some good people. I just don't know how they do it. I know there are some good people. There are some good people that really don't want to be bad people, but the odds of it are very, very low. And I think when you get to the highest echelons of power, now sometimes you can find some decent people on a local level, but we see the local level, especially in places like where I live, Los Angeles, they act like little tyrants as well. And they're not little tyrants when you're talking about millions and millions of people and the billions of dollars that flow from the central government in Washington, D.C. down to the state and local level as well. Anyways, little despots everywhere. Some hope with some people, but in general, the solution to our problem, which is generally caused by government, all of our problems, the solution to these problems is not going to government. They are not going to fix the problems that they created. Anyways, this is what Dickinson said. Power seeks to expand, so what do you do about it? He said, a free people, therefore, if you're going to be a free people, and that's what we're talking about today, who are a free people? A free people, therefore, can never be too quick in observing, nor too firm in opposing the beginnings of alteration either in form or reality. So if there are limits on government, and all artful rulers will try to expand their power on those limits of government, they'll try to go beyond them, they'll try to claim everything that they do is legal, whatever program they're implementing is legal. A free people can never be too quick. So at the very moment, at the very conception stage, they are not necessarily pointing out how it's just a problem, but also they can't be too firm in opposing, in resisting that. And how do we keep them in check? Beyond that, here's how Lysander Spooner put it in his great 1850 paper, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves. He says, the right of the people to resist usurpation, that's an exercise of power outside the Constitution. The right of the people to resist usurpation on the part of the government is strictly a constitutional right. It's a right about, I don't like that phrase, to be honest with you. I don't like calling anything a constitutional right. It's an inherent right. It's our natural right. If there's a constitution of government and government's supposed to follow those rules and it's given legal force by the people of the several states, then the people have the final say. They have final authority, and you don't need to look to the document for this, but he's basically saying this is a right about how to keep the Constitution in check. And that's what he goes on a little further. He says the exercise of this right is neither rebellion against the Constitution nor revolution. So as soon as they go out beyond the bounds of the Constitution, this is what Jefferson said in 1798 in his recommendation for nullification being the rightful remedy for those acts beyond the limits of the Constitution. Same thing as Jefferson here. The exercise of the right is neither rebellion nor revolution. It is a maintenance of the Constitution itself by keeping the government within the Constitution. So if the government does stuff beyond the Constitution and the people resist it and they can't enforce it, then the government may want to. It's like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does the tree really fall? It's that kind of philosophical question. But on a more practical level, if government wants to enforce something and no one goes along with it, they can't enforce it. It's as if they never passed it in the first place. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to do this resistance. Dealing with government, government is an incredibly dangerous force, especially when you're talking about the largest one in history. They've got a lot of firepower, a lot of ways of coercing people. But here's how Spooner continues. He said it is also resistance of usurpation, resisting government acts that shouldn't exist in the first place, not waiting for government to tell people that they can resist, because then it's not resistance. It's just waiting for permission. That's not what a free people do. A free people resist usurpation. He says it's also a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers who attempt to set up their own personal authority and power in opposition to those of the Constitution and people, which they were appointed to administer. I covered this in some detail in an episode in September, Spooner's strategy to stop usurpation. This is amazing if you really pay. It's actually one of my favorite episodes, and I'm thinking of creating a section where I pick out maybe my top 5 or 10 episodes from the last few years and just listing it over on our show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But I think it's fascinating how Spooner, the famed anarchist, which some people point to as just thinking that the Constitution is pointless, but he made many arguments regarding the Constitution, a lot of study of it over the years. And he actually made this notion of resistance, dealing with usurpation. Many of his views were almost the same as the Federalist supporters of the Constitution back during the ratification debates, talking about how any act outside of the Constitution is void, and then it's up to the people to resist it, to use in the states and localities and individuals to oppose it in order to keep it in check. I encourage you to check that episode out. Of course, it'll be in the show notes. And here's how Thomas Jefferson put it. This was in his summary view of the rights of British America in 1774. It's a paraphrase, but he said, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. If you're a free people, who are a free people? A free people to Jefferson are those who exercise their rights whether government wants them to or not. And so I guess to answer the question, if I put these all together from my notes, if I think about all these views over a number of, or actually over a century, if we're looking back to the 1760s all the way to the 1850s and beyond, it's about a century. Who are a free people? I think we have 4 essential requirements, 4 pillars of a free society. 1, government is so restricted, at least on paper, that it's extremely difficult for them to go beyond those limits without it being obvious to the people. So They're restricted to doing only a certain amount of things. 2, people have to then be aware of those limits on power, and they have to be on board with them. So if we're talking about a step-by-step approach, we're at 1-ish, definitely not 2, because in general, the people of the several states are not aware of the limits on federal power and the Constitution as approved by the people of the several states, and not even in general. It's a vast, vast majority have no clue about that, and so many people aren't on board with it either. So that's the second thing that you need. Then the third thing you need is you can't rely on government to determine the extent of its own power. So if you have an educated populace, then you don't just wait for the government to tell the people what their constitution means. It's up to the people to make the final say on that all the time. And then finally, when government goes beyond those limits, the people have to resist, and they have to resist in big ways. And I think Samuel Adams probably summed up this whole view the best in his great, I think this was in 1771 in the Boston Gazette, which was the publication organ for the Sons of Liberty. We can call it that. This is October 14th, I think, 1771. He said, "The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought." Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. I hope it was fun to watch or listen to. I think somebody was mentioning earlier, and I'm sorry I'm not looking really close on the live chat earlier in the show, but I think someone mentioned there were some difficulties with the live stream. I apologize for that. If there were any troubles, hopefully in post-processing, the live platforms will have the full video full and clean, because I see it recording here. Of course, we do upload the video a bunch of different places. The archive goes to Gab TV and Brighteon and BitChute and Rumble, and now we're on Sovereign.media, which is Ben Swan's new platform. We put it everywhere possible. That way you don't have to rely on the mainstream platforms, which are probably going to kick us all off at some point. We don't have to rely on those mainstream platforms to be able to communicate and build this community that you have been so instrumental in helping me expand and grow. Of course, the podcast edition as well. That's all 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You're going to find all of that. I want to say a quick hello to everyone on the live chat. Well, or a quick thank you to everyone who's been joining the live chat. There's Missouri Liberty Alliance. Thanks for being here, buddy. Joseph Rikers, Robert Allen Camp, Andy Blue, William Adams, Gary Townsend, Tim Martin, Sharon Patriot, who is actually pointing out there were issues with the stream. Hopefully it cleared up. Cowboy Roy Rogers, Clay Kent, less bad is still bad. Absolutely. Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana. So if you got a senator in Elkhart, Indiana who's on this stream, maybe we do have hope. There's one good one out there. That's awesome. Thanks for being here, sir. Philip, Richard Banks, Laura in rural Illinois. Jay Armstrong is absolutely right. We are in a post-constitutional era where the de facto U.S. federal government has no boundaries or limitations. And I did an episode a little while ago, sometime over the summer, that was basically titled, "When Did Things Go Off the Rails?" And a lot of people say 1913 or 1865 or during the New Deal, but I made the case in that episode, I don't have it handy here, that things went off the rails in 1791. Because if we're going with this mentality, this approach, these principles from the Revolution, that soon as government sets a precedent that set the stage for unlimited power, that's from Dickinson, that's from James Otis even earlier, that's from Thomas Jefferson in 1791. If we're going on those principles, then at very latest, 1791 is when things went off the rails, when they established the first national bank for the U.S. in actual total opposition to what was planned and approved of at the Philadelphia Convention and what was approved by the people of the several states. That's a great point, Jay. We really are in a post-constitutional era. A lot of people will tell me, hey, every time you share something, I share something about the Commerce Clause or necessary and proper, some article, a video, whatever it may be, a podcast, and they'll say, well, you should show these to your senators. And no. These people don't care. What we need to do is educate more of us and then also educate us on how to actually enforce the limits on the Constitution without relying on the government to do it itself. That's what Samuel Adams said. All would be free if they A, valued freedom, and then B, defended it as they ought. He didn't say all would be free if they had the right politicians in office. Not at all. That's not the approach to freedom. Robert Allen Camp says statutes. Get back to your backbone. I'm not familiar with what that means, but thank you for your comment. Philip Lavery said Julius Caesar became a dictator in a similar way. I covered that in a recent episode about how Caesar used standing armies. This is an important history that a lot of people don't pay attention. Sharon Patriot is correct. The problem is that Congress has thrown off all restraint, and they certainly have for many, many years. But every precedent led to another precedent. For example, a lot of people turned a blind eye regarding the Patriot Act, which regarding post 9/11, all kinds of national security things. We got the Patriot Act, which led to the TSA, which led to clear, advanced, pass up the TSA, kind of like the pre-check thing, which is now going to be used for mandate requirement checks at restaurants. So if you look at where it starts from, oh, this is just for the terrorists, and then they build the technology and the tools and the power, they're going to use it in other areas over time. The Real ID Act came out of that, the no-fly list, and now we're hearing about how people shouldn't be allowed to travel. And sometimes I've seen people posting, if you don't follow our mandates, you shouldn't be able to eat. Just let people die. So there's a horrid mentality. We have to reject precedent no matter who's in power. And in fact, when we're living under a government that, let's say, at best, 10% of what it does is authorized by the Constitution, and I'm being kind of nice there, at best, then you should just reject everything that the federal government does, no matter who's in power. Turn your backs on the 202 area code and try to focus on your state and local community and your family, your individual level. That doesn't mean ignore what's going on, but ignore their laws, regulations, orders, rules, mandates, and the like. Anyways, hopefully that's helpful. Sharon Patriot is right. The Constitution depends on a self-governing people. But the problem is that the people think that the way to enforce the Constitution is to go to federal court. And it is impossible to enforce the Constitution when you've got tens of thousands of laws, regulations, and mandates on the books. It's impossible to actually get that done. Even if the Supreme Court were filled with 9 perfect originalists, perfect in every way, even if it was a debate between, we'd be way better off with a John Marshall versus, I don't know, James Iredell or something else, a different view, Oliver Ellsworth, something just different. Even the big government guys of the time back then would be way better than what we have today, but there's a numbers game. If there's so many laws and regulations on the books, the Supreme Court gets anywhere from, 8 to 15, 20,000 requests for cases every annum, every year. They take anywhere from 1 to 200, and they issue an opinion that maybe 1, 2, or 5 of them are unconstitutional. So even in a numbers game, if we're talking tens of thousands of things to do, if they were perfect, there's no chance of getting things done by going to the Supreme Court. It's pure math. Follow the science, right? There's no way. Follow the science. Makes me think of a quote we just posted on our social channels just recently from Richard Henry Lee. He wrote to his nephew. He basically said, politics is the science of fraud. So that's follow the science in our view. Anyways, I'm rambling here. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you appreciated the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you had a great weekend. And thank you again for spending some time with me and sharing the show with as many people as possible. I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.